Hello and welcome to Stef Talks Trash. I'm your host, Stefanie Valentic, Editorial Director of Waste 360. And today, I'm discussing alternative energy sources with the Clean Air Baltimore Coalition and the Energy Justice Network. We'll be discussing whether or not waste-to-energy is actually more efficient than landfilling, the environmental impact, and also the social justice and environmental justice issues surrounding waste-to-energy and incineration. Let's get started.
Thank you so much once again for joining me. Please tell me more. What is Energy Justice Network? What is its role in Baltimore, and kind of your experience working with reducing waste to energy in the city?
So we are all Energy Justice Network. Mike Ewall is our executive director, and Dante is our researcher, and I'm the Baltimore organizer. And together, Dante and I, we run the Clean Air Baltimore Coalition. And so really working towards the transition from incineration towards zero waste. And that's how we are working on waste issues.
I've been working on this with Mike for the last 6 years. We've been pushing the city throughout that time to commit to moving towards zero waste, and they dragged their feet. Then they pushed some more and they dragged their feet. Then we got to the need to extend the contract, and lo and behold, hey, we've got to extend the contract. We didn't do anything these last 6 years. So it's been very frustrating to deal with that. But we've been trying to approach it from different avenues, certainly advocating for the build out of zero waste infrastructure that we need, prohibiting future incinerator contracts at all. This facility is 35 years old. And 36 years old actually, and needs to just be gone. So not committing to any additional usage of it in the future. We're also working on a deconstruction mandate, trying to get as many local players and residents and what have you discussing construction and demolition waste, because that's another huge part of the waste stream that sometimes doesn't get tackled in communities. So yeah, those are a couple of other options. We're also working on some state legislation, trying to get incinerators out of the state's renewable portfolio standard. Maryland's the only state with incineration as tier 1, so the tier that wind and solar qualify for in those types of standards, and that's very frustrating. So now getting that out is a huge deal. So we've been working on that. And we're also trying to build out the future as well. We talk about all the negative things, but we need to talk about the positives too. So we're working on the development of a glass recovery cooperative here in the city that'll provide a few local jobs and ultimately provide some creation of new Black entrepreneurs in the city. And so we're really excited about that as well.
That's absolutely fantastic. Can you please clarify a little bit what does tier 1 exactly mean, and why were incinerators placed into that category?
Excellent questions. So tier 1 means that these are the types of energy that are going to receive renewable energy credits from your state. And so in the case of incineration, there are a few million that get delivered to our incinerator, but also to one down in Northern Virginia. Mike wants to talk a little bit about that one for sure. And they're basically saying that incineration is competitive with wind and solar, that we should spend money, just as much renewable energy money on providing that type of energy than we should for wind and solar, which is ridiculous. So that happened in 2014, I want to say.
It was 2011. Yeah, I can fill in a little bit on this. So there are about 30 states that have these renewable energy mandates, which basically require electric suppliers to have a certain percentage of renewable energy in their mix. And that percentage will go up over time from year to year. And most states have a 2-tier system. So they'll take the clean earth things, the wind, solar, but also like burning toxic landfill gases and burning trees as biomass, and they'll put that in tier 1. And then they'll put the things that are usually already existing, no one's building new ones, like hydroelectric dams and trash incinerators, and put them in tier 2 just to appease those industries. And a lot of states intended to phase those credits out After a certain number of years, they're usually worth less, those credits. But Maryland, due to a nice fat check that got cut in 2011 to the Democratic Governors Association, the same year that Martin O'Malley, who later ran for president, was governor, accepted that check and then signed into law the same day the nation's first and now still only case of taking trash incineration out of tier 2 and putting in tier 1 with wind and solar, whereas credits became worth a lot more, ultimately about $2 to $7 million a year to 3 trash incinerators, 2 in Maryland, 1 in Northern Virginia. And so this has been a huge subsidy, a lot of credits from Maryland ratepayers that think they're getting clean energy like wind and solar when they hear it's renewable, and yet they're getting something dirtier than coal in terms of air pollution in various communities from trash incinerators.
Let's talk about the data behind the air pollution and anything else that you would like to talk about in terms of the inefficiencies revolving around waste to energy. So there was a report that recently came out, Beyond the Incineration, Best Waste Management Strategies for Montgomery County, Maryland. Can you please tell me a little bit about the key findings in this study and kind of what it says for waste to energy?
Sure. So I was the principal author in that report. We worked on it for several months with folks in the Zero Waste Montgomery County group, which is a number of folks, including one of our member groups, the Sugarloaf Citizens Association. And that's the community group that lives in the community where they have the county's trash incinerator and a fossil fuel power plant right next door, and just a cluster of other noxious industries that have been dumped on that rural community as basically the sacrifice zone for Montgomery County. So we recognize that trash incinerator, now that the coal plant next door is no longer burning coal and has dialed that back for years, the trash incinerator is now the largest air polluter in the county. And that has been driving a lot of health concerns, especially since there was a 2-week-long waste pile fire in 2016 that really woke the community back up. The community fought that a couple of decades ago, but was not really making an issue of it until that fire happened. And then there was a lot more attention to the need to shut it down. So even though it's the last incinerator that was built at a new site in this country, and that was back in '95, despite hundreds of attempts, they've not managed to get a new one built in this country because everyone stops them, as that community tried to. So the county executive is committed to closing that incinerator. He asked us for the environmental community's understanding of things and make sure that we have a check on the consultants that were hired with a pro-incinerator bias to give their view on that incinerator. So when we studied it, we ran a whole life cycle analysis, for the most comprehensive one you can run, 9 different criteria evaluated. And we found that incineration is far worse than directly landfilling. Of course, you're still landfilling. We found that the ash has been historically dumped on Black communities in particular, one then another, and currently is still going to a Black community right outside of Richmond, Virginia, which is one of the much more populated communities. So you're affecting a lot more people. And this toxic ash is dumped on top of the landfill as landfill cover, so it can blow into the community, which has been a problem in Baltimore as well with their ash dump. The state actually ordered them to stop using ash as landfill cover because it was blowing into the community. And yet Montgomery County, which really prides itself on social justice and being progressive and whatnot, and caring about environmental racism as a thing, is contributing to environmental racism with where they've been dumping their toxic ash. So this report looked at many different options. We found that there are less populated areas that are not a Civil Rights Act violation that they could be using. And that even if you have to truck it hundreds of miles to a distant landfill, transportation is only about 3% of the global warming impacts of the system, and similar small fraction of other impacts. And so transportation and the obsession with, oh my God, the trucks, is really misplaced because the landfills are much worse and the incinerators many times worse than that. So that travel distance is not the issue. The issue is whether you're burning or not. And that's what the study largely concluded. We also found that they can end that relationship within 6 months. And so we've been pushing the county to actually do that.
Can we talk a little bit more about the different energy sources and what's more efficient above waste to energy?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 pieces there. We could talk about the energy side specifically, or we can talk about the waste hierarchy. And so they're kind of 2 different ideas.
Yes.
So if you want to tackle both, we could do that. But yeah, so we'll start with the energy aspect. So when it comes to energy usage, I think the biggest thing we tend to disregard is the need for greater energy efficiency. That's really the largest part of being able to minimize our climate impacts, of the arguably the fastest part we could do, making sure that our buildings actually keep air in or keep heat in, more sustainable insulation, things like that. Like if we actually spent more funding in that regard, which I imagine some of the Build Back Better funding would want to go towards that type of stuff, we would be in a much better position to diminish our need to lean on any sort of dirty energy sources. Obviously, greater efficiency. Then you talk about solar and wind and energy storage, and all of those have continued to decrease in their cost over the last few years. In fact, I believe during the pandemic last year, the height of it, I guess I could say, that was when wind and solar like sunk below fossil fuel costs or what have you for like the first time. And just to have that be a thing in the midst of this very transformative space in our society, like it just underscores our need to think differently. So so that's the energy side. On the waste side, similarly, we need to focus on the reuse and redesign and reduction of materials. First and foremost, 75% at minimum of what we dispose is recyclable or compostable or reusable, according to the EPA. It could be even higher. And if we're trying to get rid of that 25% that is hard to recycle, by doing extended producer responsibility laws, actually putting in policies that say, you know what, if you're going to create a product, the municipalities can't be the ones that are responsible to handle it as we currently have in our system. That would be huge. But then you get to your composting, your actual recycling at that point. And then you continue going down the list, but as you get lower and lower, the last thing is a stabilized landfill. It's not incineration, because there's no reason for incineration to be a part of it at all. Right now, the EPA's waste hierarchy still has incineration above landfilling, and we have certainly advocated for that to be removed. And to Mike's point, like there's this ongoing perception that landfilling would be worse, when in actuality, if you remove the organic material, get that into compost and get that into even anaerobic digestion options as another last resort, you're going to be in a much more sustainable space than just choosing to burn that waste. So so we've got to make sure that more and more municipalities, cities, and even the federal government understand that there's really no place for a very archaic approach to waste management, which really just perpetuates the cradle to grave system that we've been obsessed with in our consumerist tendencies. So rather than continuing to take more carbon impact or footprint from raw materials being produced in new products, which then get burned or landfilled and you start all over again, we actually put that back in the system. And the only way you're doing that is by not incinerating it, because then you're just getting to a situation where you got to create more stuff and it starts all over again.
So what needs to be done from, you talk about removing things from the hierarchy and the different legislation that can help reduce waste. What needs to be done from that standpoint from an environmental justice perspective and the disproportionate impact this is having on Black communities?
Absolutely. I would say that there needs to be a much more aggressive approach at both local, state, and federal levels on installing more environmental justice policies. You've got New Jersey that passed a pretty good law that talks about the cumulative impacts of existing facilities and the possibility of new ones being built. So that's a huge step to prevent any sort of, whether it be a new incinerator, new chemical plant, whatever. So more municipalities and states ought to look at policies like that. But you also, again, need to look at the siting of certain facilities within communities when it comes to landfilling, when it comes to incinerators, and making sure that folks that are in these communities actually have a voice about what comes there. Right now, there's a lot of work being done in the city here in Baltimore about the prospects of building out composting, municipal composting facilities or what have you. But we would want to make sure that the community members actually have a voice in what that looks like for their community. And typically, these facilities often find themselves, particularly incinerators and landfills, sited in communities that have very limited political and monetary power. And so being able to challenge that through legislation and ongoing outside tactics with organizing is super important. And Mike and Steph, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that too.
Yeah, when we've analyzed it, we actually found that incinerators are one of the worst situations in terms of environmental racism. Uranium mines are the worst we found for indigenous communities, but for Black communities, trash incinerators are very disproportionately located in communities where Black people are more affected. If you look at the largest 20 incinerators, I think 14 of those are in communities of color, where people of color are majority, and other 2 are in communities where they're disproportionately impacted, but whites are still a slight majority. So that's about 80% of the largest ones. That's not true if you look at all the incinerators. The smaller ones, a lot more in white communities, so 2/3 are actually technically in white communities, but they tend to be having less of an impact because they're smaller, but they're also in communities where there are fewer people. So if you look at the whole industry altogether, you see, because the larger ones that are more polluting are located in more urban communities, more people are being impacted, and more of them are Black people, especially. And so that is where we see the environmental racism trend in this industry. And the answer is not enough to just say, okay, we're going to have an environmental justice policy. We'll, write a piece in our analysis that says we looked at it, but we couldn't do anything about it, so we're giving this permit out anyway. There are a lot of very weak notions of what environmental justice, or equity, as some prefer to call it, means. And equity being, poison people equally. But that's not what we're going for. So communities like Delaware County, Pennsylvania, where they send all their trash to the city of Chester, to the largest trash incinerator in the country with the fewest pollution controls, and one of the worst cases of environmental racism in the nation due to a clustering of other toxic polluters. Their understanding of environmental justice has moved them to basically say that their solid waste plan that they're developing is going to end up moving away from incineration altogether towards zero waste, and that they need to provide reparations at a minimum, not full reparations in any real sense of the word, but in a minimum make up for the lost revenue to the city when they do this, so that they're not harming a city that's already on the brink of bankruptcy, despite having an incinerator pumping some money into the community every year. So having that understanding that environmental justice means you undo the damage, you say no to permits, you make the transition. It's not just a matter of, okay, we'll study the demographics before we issue a permit anyway. That's not at all.
You mentioned getting this understanding of what needs to happen, and especially in terms of environmental racism. Is there a disconnect in terms of the education that is happening around alternative energy sources and environmental impacts, and especially with environmental justice issues?
I mean, absolutely. I think everyone tends to look at nuclear as this stopgap, and it's yeah, this will be the thing, and then eventually we'll get to wind and solar and battery storage. And it's a whole it's a big tension, quite honestly, in the environmental movement among a number of larger groups, and then the more progressive environmental groups. But to Mike's point earlier about uranium mining, there seems to be this weird, well, let's focus on what is produced in terms of climate impacts at the point of the energy production from from a nuclear plant, as opposed to the actual mining and acquiring of the material that goes into that. So that's still obviously having an impact on communities, particularly indigenous communities out west and what have you. And so we can't just disregard this one aspect of it if we're talking about using another source. Plus, again, you still have to deal with the nuclear waste and everything. So that's not anything that we want to support. But then you also have some folks advocating for biomass incinerators, so using like wood waste and otherwise to incinerate, as if that's going to be beneficial. Like, you're still burning stuff, you're still putting CO2 out. Like, why burn anything when you could manage to find different ways to be more sustainable, more efficient with the energy you already produce, decreasing the need for any new plants. It makes more sense, again, to focus on that and focus on the build out of solar and wind, as well as the decreasing cost of battery storage, than it would to try to utilize these greenwashed technologies like biomass or like nuclear energy. And so we try to convey that wherever we can. There's a report that Mike contributed to called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. Excellent name. Everyone should go check it out. And it just kind of talks about that aspect. Like, there are so many ways that we could build out a just, sustainable future right now, but you have so many players trying to maintain these ideas of green when they are in fact still very, very dirty. And that's not even to say that like solar is perfect, or wind is perfect either. I mean, right now solar panels still utilize lead in their production, but there was some study being done in the UK about potentially using bismuth instead, which is not toxic compared to lead. So, there are going to be eventual new generations of things that are even cleaner as we go on, but we need to spend more money doing the research and development of that, as opposed to these false solutions.
One of the big dividing lines that we put when we decide, okay, what is clean versus what is dirty, even though, as Dante points out, there are caveats on all of these things, even conservation not conservation, that's number one. That's just using less. It's like reduce, but like reuse, efficiency, just replacing a refrigerator or other appliances, you still have to dispose of it, hopefully recycle it. You have to create new ones, and in creating any new products, you have 70 times more waste before it even gets to the consumer shelf that is created in the production. So there's still, even with efficiency, there are problems, but still, if we had to divide a line between solutions and problems, we generally put it at the point when we're talking about energy, whether it has to continue to pollute per kilowatt hour. Are they still digging something up, processing it, creating waste for every amount of energy that's produced? And that is not something you tend to have with wind and with solar or with hydro even. But with nuclear or any kind of combustion, you're continuing to lay waste to communities on both sides of the electric generator. And that's where we have a much more serious problem with it.
So what does the ideal future look like then, in terms of efficient energy sources, to zero waste, to sustainability, and to environmental justice?
Right on. So ultimately, when we're talking about waste energy, I just want to acknowledge that it isn't a real term, and it's a PR term that is scientifically invalid. So no matter is turned into energy in a literal sense. So every ton is turned into toxic ash and air pollution. And there's much more embodied energy in the materials being burned than the incinerator can capture. So because recycling and composting the same materials save 3 to 5 times as much energy as an incinerator can create, incineration is essentially a waste of energy. So again, highlighting wind, solar, and energy storage is the future. There will be battles over that, how big, who owns and controls them, and materials used and recyclability. And the future of incineration is the continued crashing of the number of operating facilities as they almost all reach end of life in the next decade. And there hasn't been, to echo again, there hasn't been any new incinerators since 1995. So cities want to get rid of these current ones.
Plus, it's just cheaper to go in this route when we're advocating for this. I think a lot of folks that are not in environmental movements or what have you kind of look at environmentalists as super idealists, not considering the cost of things and the consequences of this, that, and the other. But that's not the case here. The finances and the benefits of the economics are on our side here. When it comes to building out a new incinerator, you could be looking at $100 million to $1 billion for a new facility. One was proposed in New York, that was $365 million. To retrofit the existing one in Hartford, another city of color exposed to a large trash incinerator for the last several decades, was going to cost the state $333 million just to retrofit it, and never mind building an entirely new one. But when you think about building out a material recovery facility, or MRF, a size of the one of San Francisco's, which is about 450,000 tons a year of processing capacity, that's about 41 million bucks just for that type of facility. And that's over half the amount of material that our incinerator here in Baltimore processes in a year. So if you're going to talk finances, let's do that. Let's talk about the fact that, like, expanding the landfill here in Baltimore would cost $100 million alone, but we could build not only that MRF, but a composting facility that could have about 120,000 tons of capacity for 13 million bucks. We could roll out not trash bins, sorry, curbside composting bins, and have a different setup when it comes to the frequency of our trash pickup and the like, for a handful of millions to add to that. So you're still short of the $100 million that would cost just for landfill expansion. So all these pieces are so much cheaper and make far more sense for the long term. And yet we, for some ungodly reason, think that we have to continue committing to this very status quo, archaic way of thinking. And to Steph's point about not only embodied energy, but the embodied value of this material that we're just sitting around burning in all these different cities. We did an analysis of the makeup of the material that's currently being incinerated that comes from within Baltimore City's jurisdiction. And that estimates to about $40 million worth of metals, worth of plastics, worth of glass, worth of aluminum and the like, HDPE plastics, all that we're just burning, as opposed to committing to collecting that, localizing recovery, doing the reuse. And the reuse aspect is the largest job producer we could manage in the waste stream. You get 300 jobs per 10,000 tons of material managed in a reuse and remanufacturing system, as opposed to 36 jobs per 10,000 for recycling and only 1 job for incineration, and maybe 4 to 6 for landfilling. So again, the financials, the numbers, the data on our side. So we need more legislators to come to our side and actually understand that this is the way to go, whether it be in Baltimore, whether it be in Detroit, where they did have their incinerator closed, but now they're just landfilling stuff because land is cheap in the state. Like, stop doing that and actually commit to building out a greater future for your city, which is at the intersection of environmental and economic justice.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of Stef Talks Trash. For this and other episodes, please visit waste360.com. Don't be trashy.